Chapter 6 Brillandsharn. The stone steps led down into a dark hall. It might have been a towering hallway for a gnome, but Dane had to duck to keep from striking his head against the ceiling. Once Jode had joined them, the illusionary garden shimmered back into place, leaving them isolated in full darkness. "You found out about all of this in one morning?" Dane said, using one hand to feel his way along the stone wall. "I've dealt with gnomes before," Jode said. "Once I heard Alina was in Sharn. It was just a matter of dropping the right names, passing a few coins to the right people, spend a few months in Zilargo. You'll learn how it works, if you survive." "I didn't know you'd been to Zilargo." Dane had never seen the homeland of the gnomes. "Scary place, my friend. Like a poisonous flower." The hallway was quite short, and within a few moments, Dane came up against the stone wall. There was a loud click, and the stone shifted forward, revealing the well-lit chamber that lay beyond. Dane stepped through the doorway and stood up. The ceilings were just high enough for him to stand without crouching. The room was an unusual sight. It was a square chamber and each wall about 20 feet long. A large circular fire pit dominated the center of the room, but instead of coals, it was filled with amethyst crystals. Violet flames danced above the pit, and a pleasant, flowery smell filled the air. An assortment of chairs and couches ringed the pit, and while most were sized for gnomes, there were a few built to human scale. One divan seemed to have been designed for an ogre, though Dane couldn't see how an ogre would fit through the tiny hall. But the most disorienting aspect of the room was the mirrors. 3 of the walls were entirely covered with mirrors, creating a dizzying sense of space. The 4th wall was a single window looking out off of the edge of the tower, a bird's eye view of the Dagger River and the land surrounding Sharn, with only a window and a few wisps of cloud between them and the cliffs thousands of feet below. There were no obvious doors, no shelves or chests. Aside from the chairs spread around the fire pit, the only objects in the room were a set of intricate bird cages set against the wall across from the window. There were 3 cages, each made from half a dozen different precious metals woven together and studded with gems. As beautiful as the cages were, they were overshadowed by the exotic birds contained within. Dane had never seen their like. He was no druid, but he guessed that they were from lands beyond Corvair, the jungles of Eberron perhaps, or the distant plains of Saralona. Curiously, the birds were completely silent. They watched the intruders carefully, but didn't make a sound or rustle a feather. Then he realized he could see the birds in the mirror, but the mirrors, where are reflections? "I don't think they're mirrors, Dane. If I recall correctly, we're on the wrong side of the tower for a view of the dagger." "Illusions?" "That's my guess. I'll bet these images can be adjusted on demand." Jode studied the window. "The real question is this actually what's going on above the dagger right now? Or is it all an imagination?" "That's what keeps it interesting, isn't it?" It was a woman's voice, low and rough, but with a lilting lyrical cadence. It had been a long time since Dane had heard that voice, but it wasn't something you forgot. Alina Loridan Lyris was one of the most beautiful women Dane had ever seen, for all that she was only 3 feet tall. She was dressed in a diaphanous gown of white cloud silk embroidered with intricate patterns of pure gold which broke the light into thousands of shimmering shards as she moved. Her large violet eyes were a perfect match for the amethyst necklace. Her pale hair nearly matched the gold of her gown. It was split into dozens of braids, each bound with rings of silver and threaded into eyelets on the arms and back of her gown, creating a billowing golden cloak that shifted as she moved. Dane hadn't seen her a moment before. Either she'd been invisible, or she'd walked out of one of the mirrors. He and Jode appeared to be alone with her, but he knew from experience that there must be bodyguards nearby. If Alina could arrive unseen, the guards might already be in the room. Were the walls even real? Alina showed her perfect teeth in what most people would see as a smile. Dane, how lovely to see you again. When I received Jode's message, well, I never thought that our paths would cross again so soon. 8 years is a long time, Alina. I suppose it is. For you, such a pity to fade so fast. Still, I was pleased to hear that you survived your service in the war, and the disaster that stole Sire from us. She walked over to the menagerie and looked down at the birds. Can I get you anything? Water, wine, Dream Lily. I've a fine Siren vintage. It might be the last chance you have to taste it. I swore I'd never drink with you again. Suit yourself. When Alina turned around, there was a goblet of golden liquid in her hand. You always drank too much anyway. She walked across the room and sprawled languidly on a velvet couch. The amethyst flames flickered, casting violet shadows across the room. After I heard about Jode, I did a little investigation of my own, and, I must say, I was pleasantly surprised to find that you were accompanied by a young lady. She gestured idly, and an image of Leigh's face shimmered into existence in the air above her. A dragon mark heir, no less. Coming full circle, Dane. Leave her out of this, Alina, Dane said, striding over to her seat. Are you certain about that, Dane? Alina's face was expressionless, but her eyes glittered in the firelight. I understand that the young lady is in a difficult position at the moment. Perhaps... I said, leave her out of this. You're dealing with me. So I am. Alina closed her hand, and Leigh's face vanished. And what is it you want, Dane? What do you have to offer? Jode stepped forward. I'm sorry if I misled you, Lady Lyris. We are seeking honest work, not some sort of gift or exchange. With the loss of Seer, we must all find our way in this new world. A simple job, a chance to make a few sovereigns. You employ dozens of people, don't you? Surely, there's something you could use us for. Alina laughed musically, sending a shiver down Dane's spine. Honest work. You'd make a fine fool, Jode. She stared into the fire for a moment. You must be truly desperate to come to me for honest work. Yet... She studied Dane carefully. Perhaps there is something you can do for me. A servant of mine, a courier engaged in good, honest work, has gone missing. I believe that he has betrayed me and stolen my property. He wouldn't be the first, until I Sort things out, yes. I imagine that I could use a little outside assistance. If you reclaim what has been stolen from me, I should think a reward would be in order. Dane glanced at Jode. It sounded harmless enough. What can you tell us, my lady? Jode said. Alina gestured at the wall. The image of a man appeared in the reflection of the room, whether through coincidence or artifice. His location and posture mirrored that of Dane, and when Dane moved, the image duplicated his actions. Dane walked up to the wall to take a closer look at the stranger in the mirror. This is Raciel, Alina said. He was human, early 20s, with lank black hair that fell to his shoulders and spread across his chin. Under the right circumstances, he might have been handsome, but his eyes were haunted and he had a hungry, desperate look. He wore dark cavalry leather and a short black cloak, and he held a dagger in his right hand. Raciel used to be, a wind chaser, an aerial racer with a gifted touch for hippogriffs and daggerhawks. He stopped racing after a terrible accident, but he still had talent and ambition. I helped him get back on his feet, and in return, he performed certain services for me, notably bringing certain exotic goods to Sharn through the air. Recently, I paid him a great deal of money to bring a special package into the city. I know that he returned to Sharn yesterday, but I have yet to receive my merchandise, and he has gone into hiding. There are many possibilities, but I suspect that Raciel's greed finally outweighed his loyalty. As I said, it's not the first time someone has taken advantage of my generous nature. So you want us to hunt him down for you? Asked Dane. You wound me, Dane. I am not a vengeful woman. You're still alive, aren't you? I don't care what becomes of Raciel, but I want what I paid for. The goods he was carrying, or at the very least, the knowledge of who has them now. Deliver the shards, and I will pay you, say, 300 dragons. That should be more than enough to get you established in Sharn, or wherever you intend to settle. 400, Jode said. There are 4 of us. You actually think of your Warforged as an ally? I've always seen them as pets. He's right, Dane said. 400. 3.5, she said languidly. Half the coin for half a man. He's worth more than I am, Alina. What made you think I was talking about your Warforged? 4 or not at all. Oh, Dane! Alina heaved a dramatic sigh. Do you suppose I can simply conjure platinum coins from thin air? Do you really want an answer? The gnome studied him solemnly, and finally allowed a smile to cross her perfect features. Very well. For old time's sake, 400 it is. So what are we looking for? Kyber dragon shards, Alina said. A very rare form of Kyber shard at that. She waved a finger at the mirror, and the dagger in Raciel's hand shifted into a shard of black crystal laced with purple veins. The veins were faintly luminescent. Every now and then, they would flare up with a bright burst of light. I could give you a tedious lecture about their origin and value, but I imagine that your lady friend can do that just as well as I can. I know Raciel hasn't left the city yet. He may still have the shards, or he may have already sold them. In either case, finding Raciel is probably the best place to start. Dane studied his counterpart carefully. Is he dangerous? Who isn't? Elena lazily swirled her wine about in the goblet. How do you know he hasn't left the city? I have my ways. Helpful as always. Is there anything in particular about him that we ought to know? Now that you mention it, if you should cross blades, I suggest that you don't let him touch you. That's it. That's all you need to know. I'll bear that in mind. Dane turned away from the mirror. Look, Alina. I'll be the first to admit. We could use this money. But why are you doing this? You could hire a Tharask Inquisitive for a fraction of what you're offering us. Are you telling me you can't find him yourself? Dane, she said reproachfully. You won't take my gifts. Can't I help out an old friend by giving him a simple job? Your gifts are never free, and we were never friends. What's your angle here? She laughed. Oh, it seems 10 years isn't such a long time after all. You know me too well. You're right. I have a reason for wanting to use you for this. Fresh faces? Said Jode. Indeed. There's a delicate balance of power in the city. Raciel has friends. If he has betrayed me, there are people who can trace my usual sources. You're outsiders. You can't be immediately connected to me. She smiled. And if anything bad happens to you, what have I really lost? Funny, said Dane. Lady Lyris, Jode interjected. I assume that time is of the essence? What can you tell us about Raciel or his associates? How many shards does he have? How large are they? Alina reached under the sofa and produced a small packet wrapped in black leather. All of the details are here. She tossed the packet to Dane, and then produced a smaller purse. Here's a few sovereigns. It should be enough to get you started. Let me know if you need more. And now, if you don't mind, I do have other business to attend to. She gestured toward the door, and it opened again. By the way, Dane, she said as they were leaving. Yeah. If I were you, I'd buy a sword. Chapter 7. Brillandsharn. If the dragon-marked houses held power to rival nations, then the district of Dragon Towers was where they maintained their embassies and consulates. Dozens of shops promised the mystical services of the true heirs of each house, and beyond these little businesses lay the enclaves of the houses themselves, massive towers where the heirs lived and learned their arts. The great healing hall of House Jurassic was the largest to be found in Preland, and Civis Tower was a nexus for communication across Corvair. The services of the Dragonmark were expensive, and the people who thronged the streets were not the peasants and beggars found on the lower level. Here, aristocrats rubbed shoulders with knights and merchant princes. The street was a tapestry of colorful silk, and the air filled with the scents of rare perfumes and the exotic spices of the Galandra vendors. Pierce and Lay made their way through this glorious chaos. Although the streets were crowded, most people made way for the Warforged soldier. But even as Pierce scanned the streets for any possible threats, his thoughts were on the Lady Lay. Pierce had an intuitive understanding of combat, a shifting shadow, the glint of a blade, the smell of fire. He would know how to respond to such things. But He had no guidelines for the sorrow of a friend. It was not the first time he had seen pain or anger. He himself still felt the loss of each comrade who had fallen in the war, a hollow emptiness when he envisioned the faces of Joe Leg or Johnny. But no one had ever taught him what to do with these feelings or how to address the sorrow of another. So he cleared the way for the Lady Lay and waited for her emptiness to pass on its own. Ahead, he saw the sign of a smithy. The hammer and anvil seal of House Cannith was emblazoned below the name of the smith. "My lady, should we begin our inquiries with this armorer?" Lay glanced up at the sign and shook her head. "No. Black Anvil." Lay was speaking less frequently than usual. It seemed reasonable to assume that talking would help repair her damaged spirit. "I do not understand the significance of the color. Is it not the seal of House Cannith?" Lay sighed. "The powers of the house extend far beyond the actual heirs of the Mark Pierce." While her voice remained dull, she began to fall into her usual lecturing cadence. "Each house has found ways to apply the powers of its mark to provide services to the people of Corvair, but the houses have extended their influence farther into these fields. The Black Anvil indicates that the smith has been trained and licensed by a Cannith guild, and that his work will meet the standards set by the house. But he is not an heir of the blood, and could be of no use to us." "I understand, my lady." "Cannith Tower is the central enclave of the house." She pointed at the silver spire rising up ahead. "That's where we'll get our answers. If they'll speak to me." "You have your doubts?" If what that Domo said is true, then yes, I have doubts." She reached out, resting her hand on his mithril shoulder. "I just don't know what to expect. I thought the war was finally over." "Perhaps the war is never won," Pierce said. "We must simply find satisfaction in survival." Lay tightened her grip on his shoulder, and they continued on their way. Cannith Tower was a masterpiece, a testimony to the architectural talents of the House of Making. Silver threads had been embedded into the surface of the stone walls, creating the impression of a glittering web of light rising into the sky. "I remember when I first saw the tower," Lay said. "I came here to study fire binding." She pointed to a window high on the tower. "My cousin Dasei, he and I stayed in that room while we were learning. She couldn't bind to save her life, but she always managed to charm her way through the challenges." She shook her head. While Pierce listened, his attention was on the defenses of the tower. For all that they appeared to be leaded glass, he had no doubt that the windows were mystically hardened to resist physical damage. There was one central gate, and 5 guards spread before it. All 5 were identical warforged, massive warriors built from gray adamantine alloy. They stood as still as statues, but Pierce had no doubt that they had already spotted him and were evaluating the threat he might pose. Each of the forged carried a long hammer and a shield bearing the Cannith seal. Pierce couldn't spot the slightest scratch on the polished skin of any of the soldiers. This could reflect a lack of combat experience, or it could be a fringe benefit of working for the House of Making. While combat seemed unwise, Pierce loosened the chain of his flail. Should Lady Lay be threatened, he needed to be ready. "Are you certain this is a wise course of action, my lady?" Don't worry, Pierce. There is no question of violence here. Nonetheless, he could hear fear in her voice. Follow my lead. Lay took a deep breath and walked up to the gate. One of the Warforged moved to block her path. Lay made a sharp gesture with her hand. Stand aside, guardsman. I have dealings with the Baron of this house, and have no time for underlings. Pierce was watching the guard's face, and he saw a slight motion as the Warforged looked down to examine Lay's fingers. While Lay had the imperious manner of a noble, she no longer had her ring, and the guardsman held his ground. What is your name and the nature of your business? I am Lay de Canith, she snapped, an heir to the mark, and my business is not for you to know. The speaker glanced at one of the other Warforged soldiers. Pierce tightened his grip of the haft of his flail. Please inform the warden, 12, the sentinel said. One of the other Warforged nodded and entered the building. You dare to keep me waiting on the doorstep, Lay said. The guard met her gaze. His face was a steel mask of indifference, but Pierce could sense a touch of uncertainty beneath. He wasn't prepared for this situation. If you will wait one moment, I am certain that the warden will be able to assist you. Pierce could see Lay's anger building, but she maintained her composure. She had expected a cold welcome. Minutes passed. Then a new figure appeared at the gate. A large man in his late 40s. He had red hair that almost matched Lay's, but there were a few streaks of gray in his flaring mustache. He wore studded leather armor dyed a deep blue, and a harness bearing 5 rods of polished dark wood, each holding a potentially deadly enchantment, Pierce was sure. It had been 2 years since Pierce had seen this man, but he remembered him clearly. Dravot de Canith, whom they'd last seen as the warden of the White Hearth Armory. Lay glowed at the sight of a familiar face. Dravot, she cried. You're alive! She moved to embrace the warden, but a Warforged guardsman stepped into her path. Her face tightened in anger, and for a moment, Pierce thought she might actually attack the Warforged. He had heard of her exploits at the Battle of Kelden Ridge, but then Lay saw Dravot's face. She stopped, the energy draining out of her. You have no place here, Dravot said. His voice was as cold as his expression. You have been declared excoriate, and have no rights to the name of this house. You are to have no dealings with this house or its heirs, and you are not to present yourself as enclaves of the house. Failure to comply with the dictates of the house will be dealt with. His hand dropped to one of his wands. But Dravot, Lay grasped for words. Clearly, she hadn't expected such treatment from a familiar face. Tell me why. What have I done? Dravot's face was as impassive as any of the Warforged. You have no rights to any answer, and you will receive nothing from any member of this house. You will leave this place now, and you will not trouble the rightful heirs of this house ever again. Do you understand? Dravot, you will receive no answer from any member of the house. Do you understand? Dravot drew one of his wands, glittering darkwood bearing a single band of gold. Pierce studied the wand, determining whether he could shatter it with his flail before Dravot could unleash its powers. But as he let the chain slide free, Lay nodded. Let's go, Pierce, she said. Turning, she looked back at Dravot. I'm glad that you're alive. He said nothing, and the wand stayed level in his hand. Slowly, Lay and Pierce walked away from the tower. Lay seemed dazed. Pierce put his hand on her back, holding her up and keeping her moving. They'd walked about 50 yards when there was a loud whisper. Jura still lives in Darkheart Woods. It was Dravat's voice. Looking back, Pierce saw Dravat still standing at the gate of the enclave. Apparently, he had used some magic to send the whispered words along the length of the street. Pierce looked down at Lay. The words had roused her from her shock, and now she was deep in thought. My lady. She raised her hand. Let's go back to the Manticore. I need to consider this. Chapter 8. Brillandsharn. I don't know why I let you talk me into this, Dane said as he and Jode walked back to the central lift. Nearby, a merchant was haggling with a customer over the price of an iridescent doublet, while a tiny gnome girl with a bright red cap was playing with a shimmering ball of light, woven from strands of illusion. The girl's pointed cap was nearly as tall as she was. We're soldiers, not inquisitives. And I never plan to see Alina again, let alone work for her. You know, we've never talked about what you did for her. That's right. Dane, I know it's not what you had in mind, but the war is all over, and Seer is gone. Nothing's going to change that. We need a new start, and if you've got a better way to get 400 dragons... They walked a ways in silence. Extraordinary collection of birds, wasn't it? Such beautiful coloring. True, Dane said. I wonder who they were before. Jode chuckled and let the matter drop. Once they were on the lift along with a few other residents, Dane unwrapped the leather packet. There was a sheaf of parchment inside, covered with sketches and Alina's neat handwriting. Dane and Jode split up the pages and began to sort through them. One page described the Kyber dragon shards. It was mostly arcane gibberish, and Dane resolved to have Lay look it over. There was a map of Sharn with brief notes on a few highlighted districts. The last few pages in Dane's stack concerned Raciel. One included sketches of his face from a few different angles, while the other was a brief biography. Raciel Tan, Dane mused, studying the parchment. Here's something Alina didn't mention. He used to be part of the Sharn Watch, a unit called the Gold Wings. Yes, that fits, said Jode, tapping the top sheet on his pile, a description of various sporting events. Look over there. Those hippogriff riders? They're Gold Wings. The unit's trained for scouting and responding to aerial crimes. But apparently, many of the riders already participate in the games. And as a former guardsman, Raciel would know how to avoid the patrols searching for smugglers. Assuming he doesn't still have friends on the inside. So a guardsman down on his luck turns to crime. A tragedy of our times. Apparently, he claimed the trophy in the race of 8 wins 2 years ago. Mean anything to you? Yes, it's all here. Annual events in Dura Tower, biggest race in Sharn, bring spectators from across Corvair. You'll never see anything like it. The new voice managed to be high-pitched and gravelly at the same time. Turning around, Dane discovered a small goblin girl just behind his legs. All manner of beasts chasing and fighting, darting between the parapets. Her red eyes gleamed. Last year, the griffin turned on the eagle right after the bell was rung. You can still see the blood on Kelsa's spire. Jode spoke before Dane could chase the goblin off. "What's your favorite beast?" "The gargoyle, of course," the girl said, as if speaking to an even smaller child. "Malian's gate used to be that bat, but now it's the gargoyle. He hasn't won yet, but he's fast and quick and clever, and I'm sure this year is when things will change." "Who's won the last few years?" "The stupid Pegasus. The hippogriff was going to win. Then it died." "One of the others killed it?" "No. That would have been more fun." The little green girl gestured with her hand, showing a path of flight followed by a sudden drop. "It just died. Left a big stain on Rattlestone Square. My friend Galt has 2 feathers." The lift paused to take on 2 new passengers, both wearing the green and black uniforms of the Sharn Watch. The stocky dwarf glared at Dane suspiciously. His companion was a tall human woman whose face was a maze of scars. Dane absently ran a finger along the scar that ran down his left cheek, remembering past battles with Brellish soldiers. The lift began to move again, slowly falling the remaining 1,000 feet toward the ground. "The Pegasus is really, really fast," the goblin girl said. "But Caralag is clever, and I know he'll get the best of it this year." "Did you ever—" Jode began. The dwarf grabbed the goblin by her hair and pulled her back, causing her to yelp with pain. "You again," he spat. "What did I tell you about riding the lifts, girl?" The girl tried to turn, but the grip on her hair was too strong. "Do know. Just wanted to see the sky." "You know what I said," the dwarf said. He put one calloused hand around her throat and lifted her up into the air. Behind him, his companion smirked. "And I said I'd throw you off the lift myself, if I ever saw you again. Should have stayed where you belong, girl." The dwarf moved to the railing, the goblin kicking and gasping in his grip. Dane planted his foot behind the dwarf's knee and sent him tumbling to the ground. The girl darted behind Dane, huddling against the railing. The dwarf rose to his feet. "Dawn's teeth!" he swore, drawing a short sword with a well-worn edge. "You've just made a grave error, mourner." The scarred woman was carrying a halberd, and she moved to flank Dane. "And I should watch you throw a girl to her death?" "That's no girl. It's a goblin. The only reason she's on this lift is to pick the pockets of fool like you. But I suppose you can identify with that. I can't imagine a mourner trash having any proper business in the upper wards." He studied Dane carefully. "You just struck an officer of the watch. I think you deserve another scar for that." "I think I'll pass." Dane studied his opponents, shifting so his back was against the railing. He reached for his sword and remembered it was gone. "Damn Jode." "Draw your knife, boy. Give me a reason to run you through." The lift came to a stop, and the other passengers scurried off, leaving only Dane, Jode, the 2 guards, and the whimpering goblin girl. The dwarf walked toward Dane as the lift moved again. "Not so bold now, are you?" He stared up into Dane's eyes, putting the point of his blade against Dane's throat. Dane looked down. The halberdier watched as a tiny spot of blood blossomed on Dane's throat, and for a moment she lowered her guard. Dane was waiting for an opening, but help came from an unexpected quarter. The goblin girl cried out and threw herself at the dwarf, clawing and biting at his leg. As the guardsman glanced down, Dane smashed his hand and sent his sword flying. The halberdier brought her point in line, then suddenly gasped and fell to the ground unnoticed. In the chaos, Jode had stepped up behind her and pierced her knee with his stiletto. While he spent most of his time treating injuries, Jode had a keen understanding of pain. He knew where it hurt and how to hit it. The woman dropped her weapon and clutched at her leg, oblivious to her surroundings. "Let it go," Dane said to the dwarf. "This can end now. No more harm done." The dwarf responded with an incoherent howl. He charged, but Dane ducked out of the way. Spitting with rage, the guardsman snatched the fallen halberd and charged again, blade leveled at Dane's chest. At the last second, Dane spun out of the way. He grabbed the upper half of the weapon and threw all his weight into it. He meant to disarm the dwarf, but he overestimated his opponent's weight and momentum. With a long cry, the dwarf went sailing over the railing and disappeared. Dane ran to the edge of the lift, but there was nothing to be done. He turned around. "Jode," he snapped, "make sure that woman doesn't bleed to death. Quickly! We're getting off at the next stop." Jode seemed unperturbed as he went to his task. "And here I thought I'd get to keep a feather." The goblin was crying. "You're fine now," Dane said, kneeling over her. "But you need to get up and get moving." "You have a home?" She nodded, brushing at her tears. "Go straight home, now, and don't come back to this lift, ever. Do you understand me?" She nodded again. A moment later, the lift came to the next stop. The goblin girl disappeared into the shadows of the street. Dane and Jode sauntered off as nonchalantly as possible, passing through the crowd waiting to board. Back on the disc, the semi-conscious guard clutched her knee and moaned. "What do you mean you saw her take it?" "You didn't?" said Jode. "It was such an obvious lift. I assumed it was a gift. You're a soft touch. I'm sure she needed the money just as much as we did." "Oh, this day just keeps getting better. You pawned my grandfather's sword, convinced me to take a job from Alina. Watch as a pickpocket steals the money we received for expenses, and the best part? I just killed a member of the city guard." "You don't know that. This is Sharn. The city guard very likely carries charms against such happenings." He smiled mischievously. "Maybe someone caught him." "Against falling hundreds of feet?" Jode shrugged. "This is Sharn." Dane closed his eyes and groaned. They were sitting at a table in the Manticore, and now that they only had Jode's original stake money from the morning, they were drinking water. It wasn't long before Pierce and Lay returned. "Was your mission successful, Captain?" Pierce inquired. Lay seemed lost in thought. Jode answered for him. "Aside from Dane being a murderer and getting robbed by a little girl, I'd say so. We need to track down a smuggler, return some stolen goods, and if we succeed, we're looking at more money than you'd have made in another 30 years in the army." "I wasn't paid for my service." "Proving my point. How about you? Any news?" Pierce looked to Lay. When she said nothing, he continued. "The accusation was true. Lay has been an outcast. No member of House Cannith will speak to her, however." "There is someone," Lay said quietly. "An uncle. Uncle Jura. I haven't spoken to him since, I was a child. But now, he may be able to tell me what's going on, or get a message to Hadran for me. I haven't seen Jura for such a long time. He's..." She paused, but couldn't seem to find the right words. Finally, she looked up at Dane. "I'd appreciate it if you'd come with me." Dane stood up. "All right, but if you don't mind, let's avoid the area around the Denies lift." Chapter 9. Brillandsharn. Your Canith lords may be brilliant artificers, but I can't say much for their taste in architecture, said Dane, examining the mansion, built from black granite with walls carved to resemble a dense thicket of trees. Jura's manor was named Darkheart Woods. Lay said nothing. At the gate to the mansion, a warforged servant met them and led them inside without a word. Where Hadran's servant was an imposing bejeweled figure, this construct was a spindly assembly of wood and leather that seemed on the verge of falling apart. It smelled of mildew and clicked and clattered with every motion. Entering the manor was like walking into a swamp. The air was unnaturally warm and moist, and the smell of rotting vegetation filled their nostrils. Glistening ivy covered the walls, and woven rushes were spread in place of carpets. Globes of mystical energy lit the halls, but these were shuttered, and the ambience was dark and wet. The man likes his plants, Dane muttered. Why a man would spend good gold to grow weeds inside his house was beyond his understanding. Oh, Uncle Jura loves plants, Lay said absently. Her thoughts seemed far away. After leading them through a green maze of hallways, the Warforged guide paused at a large pair of double doors and rapped sharply. The doors slowly swung open, propelled by invisible hands. A wall of mist hid the chamber beyond. Dane glanced at Lay, but she shrugged. More Canith tricks, he thought. The Warforged turned to them and bowed. Lord Jura awaits you, it said, its voice a raspy rustle. The fog concealed the forest. When Dane stepped through the mist, his boot sank into muddy earth. A dense grove of trees spread out before him. Tendrils of mist drifted across the ground, and he could hear the sounds of insects and the rustle of birds and rodents all around. What is this? He whispered, his dagger already in his hand. Don't worry, Lay said, as she came through the mist behind them. Uncle Jura? She called, peering into the woods. Over here, girl! The deep voice came from somewhere in the center of the grove. Just follow the path. I'll give you more light. With that, the sun came up. At least, the sky brightened to the color of full daylight. Studying the sky, Dane spotted a stone seam. They were standing in a vast chamber. The high domed ceiling was painted with a perfect illusion of a cloudy sky. Still, the mud seemed real enough. Jode whistled. Now, I've seen some fine shadow work in my time, but this? Do you know how much he must have spent just on the moisture? Do you think he can make it rain in here? Lay dismissed him with a wave of her hand. Hush, and don't mention the trees. I'll explain later. She led the way down a wide, muddy path, and they passed beneath the canopy of the trees. After a few twists, they came to a large clearing. Jura Darkheart was waiting for them. He shared Lay's coloring, pale skin and red hair, but otherwise the two couldn't have been more different. Dane had seen corpses that looked healthier than Jura. The excoriate lord was little more than a skeleton, with leathery skin stretched across protruding bones. His fine velvet clothing hung from his emaciated frame, and what little hair he had was concentrated in a scraggly beard. Jura sat cross-legged on an enormous wooden throne carved from the stump of a fallen darkwood tree. He had a small knife in one hand, and a long darkwood staff laid across his legs. and he was whittling figures on the surface of his staff. He did not look up to acknowledge his guests. "Lord Jura!" Jode called out before Lay could speak. "Thank you for allowing us into your home. What a fantastic throne you have. Truly, I've never seen its equal." Lay gritted her teeth, but held her tongue. Jura looked up from his work and studied the halfling carefully, his gaze lingering on Jode's dragon mark. "It cost me dearly, Jurassic. It meant a great deal to my wife, rest her soul." His voice was deep, but cold and emotionless. "Did something happen to your wife, my lord? Allow me to extend my most sincere condolences. If we can—" "Enough," Jura said, and his cold gaze was enough to silence even Jode. He looked at Lay and ran one hand along his dark staff. "I trust you had good reason to disturb me, girl." "I wanted to see how you were, uncle." The air was warm and full of moisture, and Dane could see sweat on her brow. "Don't insult me. I know why you're here. You want to know about Hadran, and why you're not welcome at the family door anymore. And who better to talk to than old Jura, the last dog chased from the house?" As he talked, Lay seemed to regain a little of her usual fire. "Spare me your self-pity, uncle. I've got troubles enough of my own. At least you have your own private palace to sulk in." Jura chuckled, a horrible rasping sound. "At least you still have spirit, girl. Very well. Ask your questions." "Why won't Hadran see me?" "Because he died a week ago." Lay gaped at him, shocked to silence. "I understand. He was torn to pieces. The work of a wild beast. Perhaps a shifter of exceptional strength. Or a well-crafted homunculus, of course." Dane stepped up. "What are you saying? They can't blame Lay for this." "Don't be ridiculous," Jura said. "Even if she had been in Sharn, no one thinks she has the talent to build a homunculus with such power." "Then why?" Lay trembled with rage. "Why am I outcast?" "Lower your voice, girl," Jura said. "We may both be outcasts in the eyes of our houses, but I am lord of this manor, and I expect you to show proper respect." For a moment, Dane thought that Lay was going to attack the old man. Then she stepped back and looked down at the ground. "Why have I been cast out of our house, Lord Jura?" "The last year has brought many changes to House Cannith, girl. The High Council of the house was destroyed long with Seer, and over the last month, the Barons have been fighting to establish a new order. Baron Merrick's of Sharn is now the ultimate power in the south, and he personally ordered your excoriation." "I've never even met Merrick's. I've only been in Sharn once before. What have I done?" "The council may be dissolved, but Merrick's would still need to justify his action to the surviving elders. You know the possibilities as well as I do. Treason, conduct bringing shame upon the house, and of course, miscegenation." He cast a speculative glance at Jode. "You really don't know?" "No," said Lay. "I've done nothing to warrant this." "Then perhaps it's all a mistake.
Will you speak for me, uncle? Plead my case to the Baron.
Talk sense, girl. I am as much an outcast as you are. I may have made contacts in the house over the years, but the Baron would never speak to me, let alone listen to my words. And even if I could get an audience, I wouldn't waste that goodwill I have built up on you. I have my own interests to look after. Now that my wife is gone, I hope to return to the house myself. Merrick's needs powerful supporters, and gold I have to spare.
Joe jumped in again. I see. So while you cannot speak on behalf of the Lady Lay, you summoned us here to provide material assistance, yes?
You amuse me, halfling. No, I have no intention of wasting my coin on such a useless investment.
Then if I may ask, my lord, why did you grant us this audience at all?
Jura smiled. I have been exiled for many years. Perhaps it amused me to see someone in a worse position than my own.
Dane's hand tightened on the hilt of his dagger, and even Jode seemed close to anger. Lay put her hands on their shoulders, holding them back. Then I believe our business here is concluded, uncle.
Not entirely, Jura said, rising to his feet. In truth, I agreed to see you at the request of an old associate who wanted me to set up a meeting on her behalf. If you want to speak with her, go to the broken church in Malian's Gate. Tell the keeper that you're looking for the wind. And when she arrives, you'll need to give her this.
He tossed the dark staff to Lay, who winced as if it burned her hands.
Who?
Dane began.
I have said all I intend to say, Jura snapped. Now leave my house. Darkheart Woods is no place for unwelcome guests.
Dane turned to ask Lay's opinion, but she was already halfway down the path to the gate. Night was falling as they made their way back to Dassey's Inn. Pierce led the way through the streets, his eyes ever watching for trouble. Jode tagged behind, lost in his own thoughts. Lay, walking next to Dane, held the dark staff as if it was covered with poisoned spines, and her expression was grim.
Time to explain, Lay, said Dane, scowling.
That he wasn't responsible for his behavior. Whether or not that's true, he's not the man I knew as a child.
Darkwood, huh?
Dane reflected for a moment. How did she die? How do dryads ever die? Dane reflected on the wooden throne in the indoor grove, carved from the stump of a darkwood tree. He glanced over at the black staff. The top was carved to resemble the head of a beautiful woman with long tresses running down the shaft. So, that's Darkheart? Your guess is as good as mine. Charming. They walked the rest of the way in silence.